What is architecture? To distinguish it from mere building, you might say it is the decoration of construction. It inseparably combines aesthetics with utility, appearances with function. Architecture creates beauty, order, and harmony. It provides shelter from the elements, and it provides comfortable places for dwelling, working, living, and praying. But it is more than that. Architecture is the physical embodiment of a culture. It is the mirror in which a civilization sees itself. Architecture was of great importance to Hildebrand. In his introduction to his aesthetic, he wrote, quote, "From the perspective of the ecology of the spirit, it is necessary for us to grasp that the elimination of poetry from life, the destruction of the beauty of nature, and especially the beauty of architecture, terribly impoverishes human existence and indeed damages and undermines it." In volume 2 of his aesthetics, he says there are 3 unique features of architecture that distinguish it from other forms of art. The first is that, quote, "Unlike all the other arts, architectural works of art belong to the same reality as we ourselves and the nature that surrounds us. Architecture is part of the real world in which we move." In other words, architecture is not a representation or imitation of something else. It is the thing itself. It creates the world in which we live. The second unique feature is that architecture has a polarity, since buildings have insides and outsides, which we experience differently. And the third feature is that, quote, "Architecture has the basic function of creating human space and thereby creating a presupposition for all the other arts," unquote. Thus, architecture creates places for sculpture, paintings, and thus it matters greatly about light and location. You cannot hang a painting in a forest. Hildebrand also says that architecture provides an experience of space different from that found in nature. This is because it creates a fundamentally human space. And as some examples of masterpieces he offers are Hagia Sophia, which has already been mentioned, San Marco in Venice, Santa Croce in Florence. No? Well, sorry, my mistake. Okay, and the Cathedral of Chartres. Such buildings, he notes, create a feeling of delight and nobility in us. And similar to what I previously said, Hildebrand maintains that architecture has 2 purposes, a practical one and a spiritual one. The former is self-evident. Architecture provides shelter and comfort, a place for human activity such as work. He means a spiritual purpose in a broad sense. It can include sacred architecture, but also merely cultural architecture, such as the design of a concert hall. This spiritual purpose can also be found on a mundane level. It can be found not just in churches, but even in a home, the place where one experiences the great majority of one's life, of being human, of having conversations, and interacting with one's family. Although he doesn't touch upon such matters, I'd like to emphasize that architecture is the most political of the arts, since it is forced upon us. We cannot avoid architecture in a way we can avoid a painting in a museum or a particular novel. You have no choice to walk down a street lined with one structure after another, and you often have little choice as to where you work, live, and pray. And unless you're in the middle of nature, architecture is the backdrop of your life. All architecture influences how we feel, both psychologically and physically, even if we do not consciously notice it. For instance, a heavy mass dangling over your head can cause fear, while an uneven floor can cause disorientation. Architecture is also political, since every new structure must either harmonize with its surroundings or clash with them. Every building thus shows or fails to show respect for continuity and the past. A new building is either respectful or not toward its pre-existing neighbors and toward us. Civility is one of the great virtues of architecture. All architecture expresses ideas, even if we do not recognize them consciously. Suppose I told you that a building you thought was made of brick and mortar was actually made of styrofoam and rubber cement made to look like brick and mortar. Your understanding of the building would change dramatically, and I think you'd like the building a lot less. It is less satisfying as architecture since we prefer solidity, rigidness, and permanence in our buildings, qualities that are tied up with our need for security and the pleasure we take in overcoming gravity and the elements. But on a grander level, architecture is the materialization of the ideal made material. To quote Alfred North Whitehead, philosophy, quote, builds cathedrals before the workmen have moved a stone, and it destroys them before the elements have worn down their arches. It is the architect of the buildings of the spirit, and it is also their solvent, and the spiritual precedes the material, unquote. It is crucial to add, however, that the material products of architecture in turn influence the spiritual, as Roberta has so elegantly described. There's a great quote from Winston Churchill on the rebuilding of the House of Commons, which was bombed during World War II. He said, quote, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." More polemically, the leading modernist architect Mies van der Rohe once said that architecture is the true battleground of the spirit. There is a grand tradition in Western architecture that extends back to ancient Greece and Rome. The critic Geoffrey Scott called it the architecture of humanism, of which classical architecture is one major strand. Here is a famous painting, The Architect's Dream, which depicts the continuity and variety of that tradition. One thing I also love to show about the tradition is the relatively new Euro banknotes, all of which depict architecture on one side. And they go historically from the €5 to the €10 to the €20. Here we have Gothic, 100, 200. But then we get to the 500. One of these is unlike the other, and I'll explain that in a second. I would say you can't even tell that you're looking at a building. This tradition this tradition of the architecture of humanism provides three criteria for judging a building. To use the original Latin from Vitruvius, the ancient Roman architect who is to architecture as Plato and Aristotle are to philosophy, these criteria are utilitas, firmitas, and venustas. These are most commonly translated as commodity, firmness, and delight. Firmness means that the building is structurally sound and it appears to be solid and sound. Commodity means that the building suits its purpose and context. Delight means that the building pleases the eye. It is beautiful. One of the most famous definitions of architectural beauty comes from the Renaissance architect Alberti, who said, quote, "I shall define beauty to be a harmony of all the parts, fitted together with such proportion and connection that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered but for the worse." In other words, it is an ideal of perfection. This tradition, however, was attacked and nearly destroyed in the 20th century by the ideology of modernism, which I spell with a capital M. Modernism started to become ascendant in Europe between the First and Second World Wars. Like many modern ideologies, modern architecture was founded via innumerable competing manifestos, many of them with heated, urgent language like those of a prophet. But they do have a common core. All of them assert that architecture must follow the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the all-encompassing character of a culture. Architecture must flow from the inevitable unfolding of capital H history, the self-revealing logic of its time. Rooted in the philosophy of Hegel, it is a kind of metaphysical faith in the progress of history. All of the architectural manifestos proclaimed ideologies opposed to the individual person. Only the collective mattered, the mass of men. The manifestos utterly rejected tradition and the past and called for a universal revolution in the social order. For instance, one manifesto called for a dictatorship of the machine. Another praised the death of the soul. In 1920, the leading Dutch painter and architect Theo van Doesburg said, quote, "The square is the new sign of a new humanity. It is something like the cross of the early Christians." What came to be the dominant strand of architecture, I'll call modernism, as I just said. Modernism is perhaps best described as the architecture of hyper-rationality. It is severe, disciplined, and without emotion or poetry. It is the physical manifestation of the iron cage of reason, of the mechanization of modern life. It denies not just the existence of God, but of transcendence of any kind. Here is seminal architect Le Corbusier's Dominican monastery in Sainte-Marie de la Tourette, France. Sorry, I sometimes speak French. It is not a cloister for souls, but a crematorium. Its concrete chapel is the gas chamber. I'm being a little bit polemical here, but notice there's a square in the place of a cross. Modernism's utopian spirit is that of self-conscious modernity, functionalism, hygiene, and efficiency. In short, of rational economic activity. This explains why modernist buildings, whether schools, churches, or housing, especially public housing, often look like factories or corporate office buildings. Many of the early modernists believed that there exist ideal mathematical forms, such as perfect cubes and pyramids, that can and ought to be made to exist in the real world, and anything less than those forms is deficient. In the words of Le Corbusier, Gothic architecture is not fundamentally based on spheres, cones, and cylinders. It is for that reason that a cathedral is not very beautiful. The ultimate modernist forms are those with right angles, the square, rectangle, and cube. Le Corbusier even wrote poetry praising the right angle. But in general, the modernists mostly rejected beauty altogether as a criterion for architecture. It was bourgeois, passé, and irrelevant to the zeitgeist. Modernism's favorite materials are steel, concrete, and colorless glass, all of which are industrial. They do not rely on or reflect craftsmanship. In modernism, everything is ruthlessly laid bare, nothing is hidden or held back. Indeed, in the 1960s, there began a style of architecture known as Brutalism, based on the use of raw, rough concrete. It claimed to be honest, to show the world in all of its harshness and unpleasant reality, including the threat of atomic holocaust. Although hated by the public, Brutalism still has its admirers among the elites. The BBC documentarian Jonathan Meades recently said, quote, "There is something about being excited by Brutalism which is terrifying and slightly sinister that I find very appealing. It was a harsher world with a harsher architecture." And I'd add that a few months ago, the cover story of the Washington Post magazine called for preserving brutalist buildings. The article was titled, "In Defense of the Ugly." The moralistic of modernism can be summarized by the following dictates from famous architects. One, Mies van der Rohe's, quote, "Less is more," in other words, a kind of minimalism in opposition to complexity and detail. Two, Louis Sullivan's form follows function, by which they mean that the form of a building is to be determined by nothing but its practical purpose. Three, Adolf Loos's ornament is a crime. It's in opposition to all decoration. And four, Le Corbusier's famous line, "A house is a machine for living." Now let me show you some examples of modernism. This is the Seagram building, one of the most important early modernist buildings. To me, it looks like the monolith from 2001 by other buildings by Mies van der Rohe. Here we get the United Nations building, built in what is called the international style. It's a style that lacks any national identity, as the name suggests. And that might be right for the United Nations, but you happen to see that everywhere around the world for every building built at that time period. These are travel posters from the movie Playtime by Jacques Tati, which I highly recommend. It's a great criticism of modern architecture. And as you may be able to read, these are travel posters for all different countries around the world, all with essentially the same building. Here's another famous modernist building. This is the Glass House by Philip Johnson. This is a paradigmatic example of a building as an object. This is just a building in the middle of a grass field. It's a sculpture more than a normal building. And I'd also note that it's a very difficult place to live, given that there's absolutely no privacy. And ironically, the focal point is that cylinder, because that is the bathroom. This is Cameron's house from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I like to show this house because The movie has architectural symbolism in it. As you'll recall, Cameron was incredibly neurotic with the cold, unloving parents, and thus they had him live in this steel and glass house that housed his father's Ferrari. And this is Ferris's house, which is a cozy colonial. This is an early and an important modernist house. I was talking about the importance of civility. One way of thinking about that is a building's face toward the street, whether it has a face whatsoever. And like many modernist buildings, it sort of completely shuts itself off from the street. Here's the interior of that house. To me, it's icy cold, like many modernist buildings. It's hard to imagine children playing there or the place getting messy at all with toys. Here is Le Corbusier's very famous house, the Villa Savoye. It is supported by these bare pillars called pilotti, and because of this building, you'll find exactly those pillars reproduced on buildings all around the world. Also, something you can see in this building is the emphasis on horizontal lines in modernism, while much traditional Western architecture was based on vertical lines. Le Corbusier, who was in many ways a totalitarian when it came to urban planning, wanted to destroy huge swaths of Paris and build these cruciform towers in parks. Here's what those towers would have looked like from the Seine. This picture I really like. In the back is the current headquarters of the American Institute of Architects. And in the front is their original headquarters. Again, you can see the difference between the vertical and the horizontal. Here's an example of brutalism. This is Boston City Hall. There's absolutely nothing alive in front of it for good reason. When it was built, the architect Philip Johnson said, "I love it, it's so ugly." And just try to imagine what it's like to be a citizen of Boston and wanting to go to City Hall or thinking about going to City Hall to get some public services. Is this a welcoming building or is this a frightening building? Another example of brutalism, this is public housing in Britain. And some more brutalism. You'll find that in many science fiction movies about dystopian futures, they use brutalist architecture, including in A Clockwork Orange. Modernism replaced the human needs and purposes of traditional architecture with the needs and functions of the man-machine, the human cog. For all of modernists, all of life is a work of art to be directed from above, with human beings to be redesigned, reformed, and sacrificed as necessary on a Procrustean cubicle altar. Not only did modernism eliminate ornament, it eliminated all natural forms, and this included eliminating the human face and figure. Here are some interesting differences in conceptions of the human. This is Vitruvian Man from Leonardo da Vinci. Contrast with Le Corbusier's modular man. Here we have a man with a small head, a claw for a hand, sort of built like a football player, very lumpen, and certainly not very beautiful. And then we have an example of humanity from the Bauhaus, an early modernist movement. Here we have a person outright wearing a metallic industrial mask, completely eliminating their humanity. Hildebrand opposed modernism as follows, quote, "Architecture is not only an expression of a living world of the spirit, it also has the eminent educational task today of liberating the zeitgeist from its barren depoeticization and mechanization. What spiritual nourishment a noble building offers to every passerby. Even when the passerby does not explicitly look at it, something of its poetry penetrates his life through his pores, so to speak. This is why the task for contemporary architecture is very different than at epochs in which the poetry of life still developed unchecked and a rich spiritual world filled their inner space. Today, architecture must fight against the zeitgeist, not through imitation, but through the unchecked use of great architectural inventions of the past in order to create something new that is nourished, not by the zeitgeist, but by the artistic inspiration of the architect," unquote. Jumping ahead some decades, the modernists' dream of creating a better world had failed. Their utopia never materialized, and they became demoralized. What came to be called deconstructivism, though I prefer to use the term deconstructionism for reasons I could explain later, deconstructivism was the response to these failures. Instead of trying to create a perfect world of absolute order, of absolute rationalism, deconstructivism embodies chaos and disorder and the irrational. It is fundamentally subversive. It turns architectural values upside down. Its values are instability, impermanence, disharmony, contamination, and sickness. Some buildings look like they are exploding or collapsing. Some even look like monsters, or as if having alien creatures burst out of them, or having insect-like parasites feast upon them. And indeed, I'll show you in a bit some so-called parasitic architecture, but here are some examples of deconstruction. This is a cancer center by Zaha Hadid, very esteemed architect who just died. To my mind, this looks like a place where Darth Vader goes to die. And here's the interior. Here's some of that disorientation. Look at that wall and the railing upon it. This, I hate to say, is a building designed for brain health. This is by Frank Gehry, arguably the world's most famous living architect. Here is an example of the interior. The building is actually so disorienting that they have had to keep patients away of certain areas of the building. Here's another building by Zaha Hadid. This is an example of what's called parametricism, where the architects plug some variables into a computer and just let it generate into whatever shape the computer wants it to be. And in this case, you can actually see the graph lines. Here's a pretty hideous example of deconstruction in England. Here's a building by an architect who recently won the Pritzker Prize, which is essentially the Nobel Prize of architecture. Those prizes go to the architects who build these deconstructionist buildings. On the right is a building by Frank Gehry. Obviously, it looks like it's in a state of collapse, about to fall onto the binoculars. Here is Gehry's own house in Santa Monica. Here's what it used to look like. He took what he called a dumb pre-war house and exploded it with corrugated aluminum, plywood, and aluminum fencing. And when later asked about the house, he admitted that there was some passive aggression in it because his neighbors' houses were already so ugly. Well, why couldn't he build an equally ugly house? These are examples of buildings that look incomplete and even worse, like they're about to fall over. This is a building that really upsets me. This is Cooper Union in New York by an architect named Tom Main. Looks like a building that's been hit by an airplane. And when designing this building, the architect said that that the building reflects an FU aesthetic towards the public. Here is an example of a building looking like a tornado. Another building by Frank Gehry. This is in Panama City, a place that can suffer hurricanes, and this does look like the consequence of a hurricane with the roofs piled on top of each other. Here's a building in China. This is the state TV headquarters by Rem Koolhaas. He probably has more famous proteges than any other architect today. To me, this looks like some kind of alien spacecraft that's about to kill you. Here's another example of what it does to the landscape. It's another building by Tom Main. This is a San Francisco federal building. In other words, there are courts in here. This is London City Hall. See, to me, these buildings, which are public buildings, are even worse examples since they're supposed to represent who we are as a people. Here we have a building that looks like, I mean, that's not Photoshop. There's no strange lens there. That's actually what the building looks like that's going to fall over. And here is the new Scottish Parliament. And I hate to say, this is what America would get also if we built a new Capitol building today. Deconstructionism has been heavily driven by theory, above all by the writings of the French literary critic Jacques Derrida. It is difficult to summarize his general philosophy, and Derrida was usually too devious to say what he meant, but in essence he claimed that everything is a quote-unquote text, and that all texts have no ultimate meaning. Everything is a social construct, everything is uncertain. objective knowledge and truth is impossible. He attempted to undermine the traditional Western understanding of reason, logic, and language with a view toward politicizing all thought in favor of a radical Marxism. In his literary theory, Derrida coined the word deconstruction, and he wrote extensively about architecture. He even co-designed some buildings, including with the architect Peter Eisenman. Strikingly, he once said that architecture is the last fortress of metaphysics. What he meant was that architecture, which is permanent, solid, and massive, which is the stable world we have built, is the physical embodiment of fundamental beliefs in the existence of objective truth and reason. Architecture is the reflection and creation of order itself. Derrida wished to destroy metaphysics, and by implication wished to destroy architecture. It is telling that Derrida used the metaphor of the parasite in describing his life's work. To quote one of the few passages in which he was honest about what he was doing, quote, "All I have done is dominated by the thought of a virus. The virus is in part a parasite that destroys, that introduces disorder into communication. Even from the biological standpoint, this is what happens with a virus. It derails a mechanism of the communicational type, its coding and decoding." Derrida thus saw deconstruction as something that, like a virus, destroys the culture's DNA and thus prevents the civilization from self-replicating and being passed down to the next generation. And lo and behold, there is now so-called parasitic architecture, which often preys upon traditional buildings, especially museums. So here we have a traditional building with some kind of insect feasting upon it on top. Here's an old war museum. Again, this is not Photoshop, that new edition. Again, a historic museum with some kind of crystals growing out of it. And here's another art museum with some kind of scaffolding crushing it on top. Of course, to destroy language is to destroy thought, to destroy civilization. This is why deconstructionist architects are so drawn to the Tower of Babel, a story of the simultaneous destruction of a language and a civilization. To offer some examples of architecture inspired by that story, Frank Gehry built a huge temporary installation of piled steel in Washington, D.C. he called the Tower of Babel. Another instance is the Arcelor Middle Orbit designed for the 2012 London Olympics. The designer outright said that he was inspired by the Tower of Babel. Consider the significance of the location and timing of his work. The Olympics is a special time in which the many nations of the world put aside their differences to come together in peace and communicate and interact with each other via the universal language of sports. The theme of the Tower of Babel is the opposite of that unity. And in this case, it's obviously sort of a destroyed tower. Now, what is the ultimate destroyed tower of our time? In 2011, a leading Dutch firm unveiled this design for towers to be built in Seoul, Korea. It created an uproar and was canceled. Should we be shocked by the design? It is worth remembering what the composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen said after the September 11 attacks. As you may know, he was one of the most eminent composers in the world and in his own way a deconstructionist. He slipped up in 2001 and said what many deconstructionists were thinking. He called the World Trade Center attacks the greatest work of art of all time. Similarly, the morning after the towers collapsed, the leading architect Philip Johnson told a reporter, "Wasn't that the best television you ever saw?" This is another rendering of that design for Korea. Well, what did America build to commemorate those attacks? This is the World Trade Center Memorial in Lower Manhattan. Where the modernist towers themselves stood, we dug holes in the ground, permanent voids symbolizing permanent destruction, with water literally going down the drain. At the center of that hole is a bottomless black pit. Thus, in the place of a tower, we now have an abyss. It is an abyss of nothingness. This godless memorial has no meaning, nothing sacred about it. Its motion is downward, not upward toward the heavens. To quote Nietzsche, "Are we not continually falling backward, sideways, and in all directions? Do Do top and bottom still remain? Are we not wandering through infinite nothingness? Is not the breath of empty space in our faces? Has it not grown colder? Unquote, unquote. This is nihilism. It is not hyperbole to call deconstructionist architects nihilists. Indeed, some of them have explicitly called themselves nihilists and cited Nietzsche as their inspiration. Here's an image from a 1977 book called Advertisements for Architecture. It says, to really appreciate architecture, you may even need to commit a murder. Now, this is not by some obscure architect. The author soon thereafter became the dean of the Columbia School of Architecture. To mention one more leading nihilist, the contemporary Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas, who I previously mentioned, said, quote, evil can be beautiful, and also that pornography is the last form of humanism. While working on the TV headquarters of the authoritarian Chinese state, a building I recently showed you, he employed a sweatshop with child labor. And when asked about what it was like to use child labor, he said it was complex fun. Such nihilism has direct effects in the real world. Buildings that disorient, threaten, and demoralize the public. They destabilize our view of the world and instill a sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness. They prevent any sense of the sacred, to put it mildly. They create a hostile alien environment detached from the world and that is familiar to us, a world that we can understand and know how to make our way in. It has no connection to one's town, city, or nation, nor to one's heritage. Now, I don't want to end on a totally depressing note. One bright spot is the University of Notre Dame's architecture program, which is one of the 2 or 3 schools in the country at which you can actually learn classical architecture. And there has been a modest but important resurgence of what is called new classical architecture. Here are just a few examples of new buildings. This is a new federal courthouse in Tuscaloosa, which somehow slipped through the federal approval process. And this is a building by Duncan Stroik, a beautiful church in California. I'd like to conclude with a quote from the poet Adam Mickiewicz, which Pope John Paul II quoted in his letter to artists in our packet. Mickiewicz said, "From chaos there arises the world of the spirit." Thank you.